Welcome to the Changing Rooms podcast. I'm your host, James Sims. The Changing Rooms show is all about improving the experiences of learners and teachers in physical education lessons. This is episode 2 of series 2 and is recorded in November 2022. In recent episodes, I've interviewed guests on the topics of holistic approaches to PE teaching and learning, the concept curriculum, international PE teaching, social justice in PE, as well as hosting the first ever debate project episode, which focused on what PE is, how it should be approached, and how to blend the need to teach movement whilst teaching through movement. This week, I am delighted to welcome Thomas Derbyshire to the show. Tom is a PE teacher who specialises in the pedagogy of PE for all students. Now, many of us make this statement, but to Tom, all truly means for everyone. And he has researched and enacted an approach to PE teaching and learning that incorporates the experience of SEND students at the very centre of his lessons. Tom came into teaching via an unorthodox route. Now a PE teacher and deputy SENCO, Tom entered the profession initially as an LSA, a role that Tom progressed in during his cricketing career. As Tom grew as an LSA, he became specialised in contributing to PE lessons and knowledgeable on what the ideal work of an LSA should be in PE specifically. Then he returned to university to study PE teaching, but worked as an LSA during his studies to help to support himself. Tom is now a teacher and qualified as a PE and science specialist. Tom, now an expert in the best practice in PE teaching and how to best support SEND students and incorporate LSAs into his lessons, is here today to discuss his experiences and provide advice to PE teachers facing similar challenges. Tom's school just south of Manchester provides education in a deprived environment, with currently 46% of students receiving free school meals. To quote Tom, SEND is average in my school. With these experiences and in this context, Tom is currently studying for both his MPQLT as well as his NASENCO, the National Award for SEN Coordination. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hi, James. You all right?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Looking forward to this and looking forward to learning, bluntly, Tom. I have to say, approaching this conversation, I feel there's going to be elements of this where I'm going to be kicking myself and the PE teacher I've been in the past, like, I could have done that better. And I think that might possibly be common for listeners out there in the PE sector. Let's see how that goes. It's possible. So, Tom, I'm going to start right here to kick us off. Tell us about your school. Tell us about your work. And why are we sitting here today having this conversation?
So I'm absolutely pleased to be here and having this conversation, because currently I'm in a school in Manchester where SEND is in line with national averages, but I know we're not doing everything right. I know that every school in the country is probably having this battle as SEND increases across the country. And my school, we're trying our best to embed SEND as everyday practice across every subject. But for me as a PE specialist, it's trying to make sure that within PE, we give every learner every opportunity to succeed in line with their potential and beyond, and give them that broad and balanced curriculum in order to strive to become the best it can be, and actually give them opportunities that 10, 15 years ago were just not around for PE students. And this has all come from a major passion of mine, which has now become SEND. I'll be honest, before I was a LSA, which I first went into at the age of 18, special educational needs hadn't been something that I'd really thought of, because I hadn't seen it. It wasn't me in the classroom. But as I started to work with children with special educational needs, I knew it was something that I really wanted to do, and the impact you can have upon the child's life is something that, you can't get all the time of any other job. But I think it's also a part of teaching, which can be massively neglected due to the demands of the job every single day.
Oh, really well said, Tom. And it's not just what you're saying there; it's that passion. And just going off script slightly, what was like the trigger moment for you, Tom, of like making that realization and that connection? You say you weren't necessarily expecting to sort of go into specialises. And what was the kind of what was it that ignited that?
I think I remember supporting in PE lessons, and when I first started as an LSA, there's some SENCOs will still feel today that PE doesn't need support, which I totally disagree with. PE is like every other subject. It's not an academic subject for some. Senkos. It's not an academic subject that needs any support for that child, which I totally disapprove of, because the child needs support across a whole range of lessons to have a holistic approach to education and to be able to achieve. I remember having one child that the PE teacher just didn't know how to engage a child, didn't know how to get them to serve in badminton. And it was at that point when, after 3 lessons, he managed to serve. And the PE teacher had no input at all, and I'd had the input. But that was great that he could serve. But the fact that then I seen him go to badminton lunchtime club, that was a moment that I thought, I've had an impact now. This child enjoys this. This child didn't want to come to PE. This child is now going out of their way to go to a PE club that is in their own time, and they could be doing something else. And I thought, do you know what? I've got to stick with this. I've got to pursue this, and I've got to make sure there's more children like this that have this opportunity, because sport, there's elite sport and it can become elitist, but sport is for all. And I think that's the biggest thing we've got to make sure. Sport and PE is for all. And it is a great way of bringing communities together of different cultures and races and people of different abilities together in order to succeed together. And I think it unifies at times society and shows that we can all work together.
Yeah, I echo that, and well said, by the way. I mean, I think the unifying nature of movement, of physical activity, of sport, we see that it's so clear, isn't it? It's very obvious in front of our eyes when Chloe Kelly scores and wins the Euros in summer 2022, and you see that, and you see the country go. But it's more subtle. Like I like what you said there. It brings communities together as well, and I really believe in that motif that you're referring. And I want to take it to here then. A phrase that stuck in my mind when we spoke on the phone last week, Tom, and we were sort of prepping for today. You said the following thing to me. You said, when I got my first teaching job, I literally asked the school to put the SEND students in my lessons. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so this school that I went to, my first teaching job, I ended up on long-term supply. And I turned up and they had some classes and they taught classes. And when they came down to PE, they tend to be setted as their academic ability, whereas I would ask for the ones that were, in general, lower academic ability, because that's where the majority of SEND pupils have been placed, rightly or wrongly, again, which we could argue. However, selfishly, I feel like I can have the most progress on these. And I knew one of the other teachers was all about performance. How can I do? What group of students can I get from here to this football tournament, badminton tournament, and beyond? But I was thinking, I just want these pupils to enjoy PE. I'm not bothered whether it's badminton, if it's athletics, if it's health-related fitness. I'm not bothered what they enjoy. I just want them to include it and have a chance to be healthy and active for life. And I think the fact that I'd had that opportunity before to work with SEND students, I just wanted to impart some knowledge and also develop my own expertise in working with these students in order to ensure that they could live healthy, active lifestyles. Because statistics and research will tell us that children with special educational needs don't always have the same life chances. They don't always have the same health chances. And as a result, I thought, I've got to try and impart this on them. In fact, to give them the opportunity, because I would totally understand at times PE lessons with some of these students will look a lot slower and will look a lot different to other classes, but the outcome is the same. And that's what I really wanted to make sure I had the opportunity to do. That happened in my second school, and it still happens now. And it's partly now because of what I say when I want to go into the school and part of the knowledge that I have. This is the first year, though, that I've had to take a bit of a step back and let some other teachers develop their expertise with SEND within PE. And that's through me having conversations with them, and them also getting that opportunity and us giving our holistic approach to them of who's at the front of the classroom for them as well, delivering these lessons.
Across those 3 jobs, I mean, just on a personal, how have you, and I've got no better way of asking this, how have you, air quotes, fitted in that sense, Tom? Have you found yourself that your interest, your skills, your passion for this aspect of our work, did you find that dovetailed neatly in those roles, or did you find that you were kind of having to force that approach to happen?
I think it was quite, in a way, easy for me to do, partly because the other teachers would happily give it over, because as research says, a lot of PE teachers and a lot of teachers in general lack knowledge in SEND. So as a result, the teachers, oh, you want to do that? Fantastic. You go and take it. You do what you want with them, because they weren't willing to invest the time and effort to put in to make sure these lessons were adaptable for the children in front of them. And not everything does take a lot of effort and a lot of time to make sure that these pupils are fully included and have an inclusive education. Some of the things do, but I think it's very, very obvious from all three jobs. The teachers were very happy for me to take these classes, and quite thrilled that they didn't have to do this because they found them dull lessons before. But I think we've got to change it around, and I'm a big believer that we need to have the best teacher of that subject in front of these pupils, because these pupils need the best teaching possible. We can have some teachers and teachers will have their strengths in PE, because none of us can be experts in all the different sports because they're completely different. But I think it's very important to have sometimes the best teachers you can in front of the most challenging students at times.
I think that is that what you just said there, I think, is going to stick with a lot of people that are actually going to listen to this or watch this time. And I want to take you here. So we're saying that this is your view. We're saying that this is your perspective. What you're highlighting there, that in some ways, in certain roles that you've perhaps fulfilled, you're taking that pressure on other colleagues who sort of allow that to happen. But what do you consider today to be the real issues in the PE teaching sector right now? If we go into school after school, department after department after department, what, from your perspective, of the issues that SEND students and perhaps teachers are facing?
I think some of the biggest issues currently within teaching for PE teachers and teachers of PE that teach SEND pupils is a lack of knowledge. Whether that's a lack of knowledge of including SEND pupils or a lack of knowledge of individual pupils, because I think it's very important for teachers to understand they can go on a course to understand ASD. They can go on a course to understand dyslexia. However, how that imparts on an individual child can be different from person to person, to lesson to lesson. And I think that moment of trying to take that time, because we know that time's critical within teaching, because we spend a lot of our time teaching and a lot of our time planning. Do we have the time physically to plan effectively for certain children? And it's spending that time to know the individual children within your lesson, whether that's going through the IEP, whether that's talking to someone who's very knowledgeable within the SEND department about that child. I think that's massively important, because I think we lack knowledge in SEND at the moment. And research by people like Phil Vickerman, Anthony Marr, Millie Blundell, all of that will back up what we're saying, which it's good to know that the research is out there supporting us, but what are we as professionals in the education sector currently doing to break that down? So the Youth Sport Trust have got a lot of resources out recently, just published last month. There's some research and some courses that you can go on free of charge through Sainsbury's. And I think it's very important as PE teachers that we take our time to go on these courses, whether we do it in our free time or we go and ask that member of senior leadership who's in charge of CPD, can I have the time to do this? Can I do it instead there? Because currently it's a major issue within education, in the disproportionate gap between SEND and our non-SEND pupils and achievement. But what are we doing to ensure as PE teachers we close that gap?
And what we'll do in terms of the research and the opportunities you've mentioned there, Tom, we'll make sure that when we put this out, we'll research and make sure that all of those are there in one place, that teachers, whether that's going to look at the research of the three individuals you just talked about, or whether we're looking at those courses by Sainsbury's or anyone else, we'll make sure that everyone that comes and visits this has access to that information and goes straight to that information. Again, I find that really, really interesting. And I have to say, you are almost describing my career experiences. And I'm therefore wondering and almost assuming that a lot of PE teachers who have maybe progressed through their career, I'm in my 40s now, but who are going to identify with exactly what you're describing here. So the issue seems really quite clear in my opinion. So I want to take you to this place. You've mentioned research a couple of times there. What does and of course we've got LSAs who are LSAs or TAs, they're part of our, I don't want to make it aggressive sound, but they're part of our response, our ammunition of how we actually provide better quality and more adaptability in our lessons. So what does the research actually say about the role of LSAs in PE lessons specifically, Tom?
So unfortunately, the research is quite damning unless you come from a certain background as an LSA. So unless you have knowledge of sport and PE, research near enough says you're useless in ensuring the progress of the child in that lesson when it's PE specific. So if you're trying to teach them a skill, the LSA is still having to learn it and also might not have the skills and capabilities to perform it themselves. So that is the massive part of it. But research also says that the PE teacher is not in the best place to deploy the TA if they don't understand the needs of the pupil or understand how to work effectively with the LSA. So there's a double-barreled approach to it where the LSAs are no use if we don't give them the information before the lesson. Are we speaking to them? Are we communicating with them? Are we showing them a video of a backhand serve in badminton or how we want them to bowl in cricket? Are we giving them this so they can see it in advance? Or as a PE teacher, are we taking that time to understand the child because we're the subject specialists that can be able to impart that knowledge if we know how the child actually works? Do they need some visuals? Do they need some pre-learning that maybe they could do when they've got an intervention with their LSA? What are we doing? Because currently research says LSAs need subject knowledge to be able to ensure the progress is accelerated from the pupil. And the research also said PE teachers need to understand, otherwise they can't effectively ensure the progress of the child either.
And in some ways, Tom, does that, what you just said there, does that almost summarize in some ways the gap or the space that you have filled and progressed in your own career? The fact that you've come in as an LSA, but I know you're a very good cricketer, for example, you've come in that background, that movement, performance background, you've come in this way and you've progressed into that direction. Does that space almost summarize how your career has developed?
I think so, massively, because I never ever thought that I was going to go into being an education. I always left college and they're talking about me at college. You need to apply to uni. I'll never go to uni. I'm never going to uni. That's not what I want to do. I am going to do this. I'm going to do cricket. I'm going to be a sports coach. Then I quickly realised when I became an LSA that being a sports coach would be fantastic, but can I impart the same knowledge? Can I have the same impact long term with these pupils? And then that's when I went into being an LSA. And I really do think, because I've seen it from both perspectives, from being supporting within the classroom to leading the classroom, I do really value what an LSA can do within the lesson. But I think it's very important that when we're planning our lesson or thinking about our lesson, that we take time, whether that's via email if we're really busy, to let the LSA know what's going on. That's a small, quick fix. But if we've got that 10 minutes in our day, at the end of the day, can we catch that teaching assistant or LSA before they leave? Can we give them a heads up? Can we catch them in the morning? So I think that's invaluable at times, because we're giving them a head start. Thinking of a PE perspective, they are getting that head start in the race. So they are 10 metres ahead in a 100-metre race already with that pupil. So they know where it's going. They can help that pupil. And I think sometimes what's very important as a PE teacher to understand is, if we've got badminton going on and we've got free courts who are our pupils who understand what's going on, they can work with it. Can we use the LSA to oversee what's going on there? And can we as a subject specialist go and intervene on the one court where our subject knowledge is going to be the most vital? Can we then make sure the rest of our pupils can align with the rest of them in progress? Because we have the knowledge and it's just giving ourselves that time. It's very important, I think, that, as the research says, that we don't always have to use the LSA just to deal with the pupils that they're there to support. They can support the rest of the class while you intervene and impart your subject knowledge onto the pupils who probably need it the most at that moment in time.
And would you describe that as, I mean, obviously every lesson is different. I don't want to sort of try and generalize all of your lessons, Tom, but would you say that is a common feature of your own teaching, that the way you will use the LSA in your lesson quite commonly will be, they will be supporting, let's say, that if I hope the language is acceptable, a non-SEND student in that particular moment, that particular scenario, and you will allocate more of your time to that group of SEND students, as you said, in the fourth court in this case?
I really do think it's something that's developed over my teaching career. I think that when I was an NQT, I think I was a bit scared of doing that. And I think it's very important for teachers to understand now that they are there and they line manage that teaching assistant or LSA when they are in their lesson. They are the line manager of that TA, LSA, and they tell them what they want them to do. And I think it's something that I've grown over time. And I think as I've built relationships up with LSAs and TAs, So they understand what I want and they know how I work. And I think that's vital to take that time out of them, because any adult in the room is always a fantastic resource to have. But it's only a fantastic resource if we plan and use them effectively. We just let them turn up and don't tell them what's going on. They're near enough another pupil within the classroom because they're having to learn to go as they go along. But I think it's something I've used more and more because they can oversee a larger group of students who are progressing well.
Yeah.
And we can then go and intervene. And their job isn't that taxing. At times, they're more checking for behaviour management and what you've done. Whereas you can really impart your knowledge, break down the skill, because you might teach a certain skill and the TA might not know how to get that pupil to do it, but you might be able to break it down into more chunks and scaffold it to the point that the child can really break it down and put piece by piece together for when you take that scaffolding away. Whereas unfortunately, because the LSA doesn't have that subject knowledge, they can't do that. But you are restricting the progress of the pupil if you only leave the LSA at times with the SEND students.
And Tom, in your experience, I mean, and literally in your experience, because of course you perform this LSA role, how do you find that LSAs respond to that dynamic of working? So, rather than probably what I did for years and years, which was, effectively allocate the LSA to what I consider to be the SEND student or students. In this case, monitoring, and you said even doing behaviour management. How do you find that LSAs broadly will respond to that sort of switcheroo, if I can put it that way?
I think the majority of LSAs and TAs thrive on it because actually it's slightly different to their normal role. It's something new to them.
Change up, right?
Yeah. And it's actually different. The lesson probably goes quicker for them. And with certain classes, you could maybe say that role becomes a bit easier within their lesson. And it might sound, not the nicest thing to say, but sometimes they get a break from that child if they're supporting them all day, and that child gets a break from them. Sometimes that's what they both need. Because we know if we had to work with exactly the same person side by side for 5-6 hours a day at times, there might be a lesson before where that LSA has really tried to push the pupil has not responded, and they both might not be as happy with each other. So it gives them that time to have a break and it gives a new perspective. And then we start again. And we know at times that we all like a bit of a change. And I think it gives them that opportunity. But I do think, again, coming back, that communication is vital in that happening. Yeah. If the communication doesn't happen, we can't just expect them to turn up. Let's be halfway through a lesson, right? You're doing this, now I'm doing this. Because it doesn't quite work as well. It will work, but are your outcomes as good as you want them to be? Does the progress accelerate how you would expect it to be? Not, in my experience, that does not happen. So that communication again before, and I think we're in a privileged position at times in PE, where if there's more than one class on, and you can have, because all the schools I've worked in, there's got to be someone in the changing rooms. But if you've got someone in the changing rooms and your LSA or TA is outside and you've got someone still making sure that they're behaving in the changing rooms and monitoring that, what's to say that 2 or 3 minute conversation can't happen then to just give them a bit of a heads up, show them what they want? And as much as that's not the ideal situation, we've started to break down some barriers to ensure that child or the children within that class are going to progress how you want them to.
Fantastic. And for me as well, it's a sense of respect and honor for that other professional that's in the space as well. That's one of the things I like about what you're describing here. I can really imagine how that LSA or TA is going to feel more respected and more involved in the work and considered to be the asset that they genuinely are in a school as well. And I think that's a really positive thing. But I want to take you here, Tom. So I want you to picture you've got a red button in front of you, and I want to know, if you were to hit that red button, what is it that sort of green pasture, glorious future, what are you actually advocating for here, Tom? What needs to happen? If that button was in front of you and you would hit it, what would that change be?
I think that change is to make everything as inclusive as possible. And I think we've looked at sport from the outside. Historically, sport has never been inclusive. It's always been elitist.
Yeah.
And we watch it on TV. We watch the best athletes of that sport.
Yeah.
It's only recently that things have started to change with inclusive Paralympic Games, the Invictus Games. We're starting to see, for some people out there, we're starting to see sports that they can relate to and people that they can relate to. And I think that's vitally important. I think it's vitally important to start championing some athletes who do have ASD, who do have OCD, who do have social, emotional, mental health needs. I think it's very important people like Tyson Fury come out, talk about their past, because I think it's very important to understand that he might be very physically fit, but at times he's not been healthy because he's not had his social, emotional, and mental health all place where he can be classed as being healthy. But it's important he's come out, he spoke about it. Ben Stokes has come out, spoke about his mental health. We've got many athletes like Kelly Holmes coming out, talking to us from different backgrounds, a diverse nature. People have got to be able to relate to them. And I think it's vitally important that we start putting athletes in front of our young people who they can relate to and inspire to be, and understand at times it's okay not to be okay. Because I think a lot of them think at the moment that if you are this, you've got to be very strong. And at times we all know that at times we can't all be in the most healthy mental health state of mind. We can't be in the best physical state of mind. But can we always try our best to achieve our best? Of course can. And I think that's one of the biggest things. If we teach sport in an inclusive manner, we can always inspire our children to be the best that they can be, and also take not winning in a fantastic manner, and also win gracefully, and understand that at times in life you win and at times in life you don't win. And I think that's very important, and delivering an inclusive curriculum is one of them things that can achieve that. And as a society growing out of that, when these children become young adults and then they start getting into jobs and inviting on others, I think as a society we'll become a better society for understanding the needs of people in our workplaces, for understanding how personal circumstances can affect people. And as a result, we'll become a more holistic and approachable society for people to live and work in.
Amen, basically. And I really echo. I mean, you're really touching me and some of my own personal experiences as well. I started thinking there about sport in the purest sense, and you're right about its exclusiveness. You're right about the experience of losing. One of the things I've often talked to students about, often when I'm teaching things like A-level PE, sports psychology, things like this, is that the dominant experience of sport is to lose. That if you might think of a game like hockey or football or netball, where okay, maybe you win half the time, maybe. But of course, if you're an athlete, if you're a swimmer, if you're a gymnast, you're not winning. You know, in swimming, even if you make the final, 1 in 8 people win, the rest lose. So I think it's very interesting what you're talking about here, incorporating a more inclusive model into that. And with that in mind, I want to take you here then, Tom. When we spoke on the phone, I mentioned that a couple of times, but when we spoke on the phone last week, in preparation, you used the following phrases over and over, and you said, understanding the child, understanding the lesson. Could you just broaden that out for us? What do you mean when you say that?
Understanding the child is a massive one for me. I think any teacher, any subject, if you don't understand the child in front of you, the question I always want to ask you is, how do you expect them to make progress? Mm-hmm. Because I think understanding that child, understanding the background of that child, and in this perspective, we're looking at it from a SEND point of view. If they have additional needs, what can we do to try and break down them barriers of them additional needs? What do we need to do within that lesson? What do we need to do to ensure that that child can progress in line with their peers? Take our time to understand the child. And the non-SEND children in your class, do you know what they enjoy? Do you know what makes them tick? Do you know what's going to make them blow up? So we know what we're going to do. So we know how to avoid them situations where they're going to blow up. We know how to make sure we push them that bit further because we know what they like. But understanding the lesson. As a PE teacher, I'd like to understand that we all understand the lesson that we want to deliver. We hopefully understand the outcome that we want out of the lesson. But how are we going to get there, I think, is a big point. So we've got to understand that child and we've got to understand the lesson. But then putting them together in a jigsaw can be a bit of a complex place. Yeah. And that's where if you've got an LSA or a TA in the lesson, they probably understand that child that they're there to support if they're supporting that individual child. They probably don't understand the lesson unless they've been in your lessons 5, 6, 7 times before for the same lesson. So it's another piece of the jigsaw that we've got to bring in and ensure that we give that child the best experience by making sure we understand them, we understand the lesson, and we understand every other adult that's involved in that lesson. So for me, the lesson, understanding it, is understand the outcome and what you want. Understanding the child is making sure you know everything about them. And then we create that pathway of how we're going to get to that outcome. So we need to understand the child's needs. Now we understand the outcome. We've got another adult involved. Communication, again, is key. And I think it's very important. I feel like I just keep banging on about communication, but communication is key. We can all have the knowledge. We can all go to the Autism Society and complete our autism and physical activity qualification. But do we actually understand that child who's got ASD in our class as an individual? Because boys and girls will present completely differently at times. So it's really important, I think, that we take our time to understand that what we need for that child. We probably know a lot quicker what we want out of the lesson, but how can we bring them both together? And I think that communication and a bit of research. And I think one thing we've got to remember is when we're understanding the child is to speak to the child. The child will tell you at times what they want, especially when they become older into key stage 4 especially. They will be able to tell you what works for them and what doesn't work for them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually involving the student in that kind of decision making. And we're talking. You mentioned like communication there, for example, and utilizing the role of the LSA. But there might be teachers out there who are thinking, right, how practical is this? What do I do? So what I want to say here is, if we're advocating this sort of more deliberate approach to supporting the SEND students, is it practical for PE teachers? How do teachers achieve this day to day?
So I totally think it's achievable. And one of the things that I will say to them is, I see a lot of my teachers from the past say, I don't have an LSA in my lesson, so I can't help them. But they still have that LSA in school that helps that child. There's still an IEP in most schools on that child, or there might be an EHCP that we can read on that child. Taking the time to go and speak to the adult that knows this child the best, because in general, it won't be the SENCO that knows this child the best, because they're not supporting them for the majority of the day. There'll be another adult within the school who will know this child the best to get some information from them. And then once we've got that, we can start to mold it a bit more into our subject, a bit more into a practical subject, and see how it works for them. And I think that's very, very important, because it is something that I think is going to be difficult. I do think it's probably taking the majority of PE teachers out of their comfort zone.
I agree.
And I think that is massive. We're taking them out of the comfort zone, and no one wants at times to be taken out of the comfort zone. We always find it challenging. We can find it scary. We can sometimes not do it because we don't want to fail. But as PE teachers, I like to think that we've took part in some sport or physical activity where we've not won before. And we know that actually our biggest learning and successes come from failing. So we know how to go. And it is not wrong to try and do something for a child and that child not to improve in that lesson. We try different things. It's fine for us to fail in what we've done as long as we're trying to do it with the right intentions for that child. Because PE is such a broad curriculum, and the fact that we have different sports, different activities, we can't be a subject specialist ourselves, but we can be a specialist in getting to know that child because that information is there within the school.
Interesting question for me here then. We're talking about the use of LSAs and TAs in, I don't know if that's the right language, but the use of LSA, I mean it in the most respectful way possible. Do you perceive that I know you can say, I don't teach English, I don't teach maths, but do you perceive that the use of LSAs and TAs is inferior in the PE sector to that of other subject areas, Tom? How do you see that?
I totally agree with you, especially from the majority of school point of view. Having taught, this is my first academic year of not teaching any science. And I've taught both Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 science before. So I totally understand that. I would have an LSA in my Year 9 class with a group of students every single lesson. I taught the same class of PE and never had an LSA for them. And that was quite clearly from the school's mantra and from the SENCO's mantra that science was very important and PE didn't matter. I think it's very important as PE teachers that we start to challenge this narrative, because we are subject experts and we totally understand that if our children become more inactive, and SEND children are more inactive than our non-SEND pupils, even though our non-SEND pupils' activity levels are just dropping. And I think it's vitally important that we, as there is now starting to become an obesity pandemic out there, after just having a pandemic of COVID that proved that the more active we were, we tended to recover a lot better. That physical activity is massive. we've got to try and inspire our young people to be active for life. But at times, by not having the LSA come to the lesson, we're negatively impacting the activity levels of students whose activity levels are already negatively impacted. So I think as PE subject specialists, we've got to push within our school to get the LSAs within our lesson, explain why it's important. Because ultimately, the more active we can make a pupil, the better they can contribute to society. The more money as a society we save from the NHS that then can be invested in our local communities. For example, within our SEND structures, within our schools, if we start to do this correctly. And I think it's vitally important that that's something we start to do as professionals, is start to be happy to challenge. I would happily have someone come to me and challenge me on the support where an LSA is going within the school, because ultimately what they are wanting is the best for a child within their lesson. And I don't think any teacher can argue that that's not what they want. And if it's not what they want, are they in the right profession?
Absolutely. And Tom, it's really interesting listening to you, because one of the things when I was in sort of middle management roles in PE, head of PE, that kind of role, I always considered myself very good as that person who would go and knock on the head teacher's door and go in there as kind of like almost like businessman type and get what I wanted, get that extra resource, get access to that classroom, get the computers I was asking for. And I think you're advocating here to that same level of determination, and ruthlessness is too strong a word, but you're advocating for teachers to go and knock on doors and say, we need this to happen.
100%, because if we don't do that, who's going to do it for us? And like you say, I think historically, and research will say it with us, that PE is seen as a subject that is lower down when it comes to support. Because a child EHCP might say that they're entitled to roughly 16 hours of support a week. And straight away, a majority of Senkos are thinking, right, maths, English, science, they're core subjects that need them. We've got to give them the support there. But I think, again, this is where, as a PE teacher, it's not in our control, but as a Senko or a deputy Senko or someone involved within SEND within the school, are we understanding what the child wants? Do we know what the child wants post-16? Is the support going in the right place for that child? Because I think that's vitally important. The children is massive, and pupil voice within, including a SEND pupil, is vitally important, I think, because otherwise we might think we're doing the best thing in the world for this child, but it's not what the child wants. The child wants something completely different.
You know, you're so right. It's so easy, maybe even especially with SEND students, where we think we know what's best for them.
Yeah.
And you're advocating involving them in that conversation.
I think it's massive, because I think a lot of teaching staff, especially PE staff as well, don't understand that the children have a big part in their EHCP review. They have their pupil voice, they have their parent voice. But then at times we take it away as teachers, because sometimes we think we know best, but that child knows best about them. I don't think it's wrong to approach a child and just say, you know your individual children. I know that you find this difficult. What can I do to help you? And I think sometimes as PE teachers, as all teachers, we feel scared to basically open up to a child to say, I don't actually know what to do here. But I think that's the best way at times for us to fully understand. And I think children respect that. It's like that time when you have some lessons and you know what, I've got that wrong there. I think you actually gain more respect from the pupils than not admitting that you're wrong.
So, look, brilliantly said. Let's go here. There's a PE teacher out there. They're listening to this. Maybe they're on their journey home or to work. We get a lot of people who listen to us in their car, for example. And they want to make improvements, Tom, and they want to structure their lessons in the light of what we're discussing here, and especially what you're advocating for. For that colleague, what should they do first, second, and third in order to sort of get that process kicked off?
I think the first thing is to do is know your classes.
Yeah.
So I know in some schools that we don't have to provide any data in our classes. We don't have to do certain things when we're planning lessons. We don't have to get a lesson plan. That's totally understandable. But know your children in the class. So if you've got some of your children and you see your class list and you've got 4 students, one with mild learning difficulties, one with a social, emotional, mental health need, and maybe one's got a speech and language and communication need, get to know them. Is there IEPs on them? If there's not, go and speak to a part of the SEND department. If there is, read them if you need more information. go and see the SEND department, go and see what they can help. I think that's the first thing you've got to do, get to know your classes. But I think that's the biggest one. I think that's the biggest barrier to break down because it requires time.
And you know what's wonderful about that, Tom? It's exactly what PE teachers are good at. I think if I don't want to call out any, you and I both teach science, for example, so I certainly don't want to call out science teachers, but I think if you honestly were to look across a range of teachers and range of different subjects, a range of different schools, you would find PE teachers are right up there in that capacity to get to know the kids. So it's almost in the hitting zone for our sector.
100%. And I also feel that PE teachers, because we don't have a base within the school, so we might teach inside, we might teach outside. I feel like we're just more used to, we will walk and go and speak to someone because we don't stay in our classroom because that's not the nature of our job. We might be teaching in a classroom, one lesson outside the next, and then we might be somewhere else. So I think our nature is to get up and move. So get up and move and let's make it productive and let's go and speak to someone because I think it's vitally important. And it might take 20 minutes to read an IEP, but you might get the information you need in 2 minutes from the right person that supports that child. So sometimes it's time saving as well, just speaking to someone.
Fantastic. So we've got that getting to know the students. That's what we want to do first. Where does the teacher go next?
I think secondly is then trying to incorporate it within your lesson. The next lesson you've got, try something. If it fails, who cares? You've tried and you're starting to make that progress. You're starting to now try and implement something. Because I tell you, in the second or third lesson, you'll find something. You think, do you know what? That child's done so much better now. Or do you know what? I've managed to get myself an LSA in that lesson. 1 hour, 2 lessons over the week because I've spoke to someone, I've asked to someone, I've explained why I need it. And do you know what? The lesson's a lot easier for me to teach because I'm not having to change the lesson constantly because I'm trying to engage this group of students because actually the LSA is looking after 20 of my students and I'm working with 6 of them to really push them. And now they're falling in line. We can actually have a tournament for badminton because everyone can start to serve effectively. Everyone's starting to understand a bit more. So I think that is, the second one there. Once we start to implement things after that communications happen, we're starting to reap some of the rewards of our success. And I think the third thing is just be curious. I think that is vital. Be curious. Whether that's if you are seeing what's going on in the world around us, if that's you reading some research, you get a book, or speak to other staff in the department. I think that's vital. You taught this person last year what worked for them. I think in the PE work rooms or staff rooms that I have, I think that's something that PE teachers do. Whether that's just because we enjoy talking about our lessons or we enjoy talking about the sport. But ultimately, I think it's because we do care about our pupils, but we've got to make sure that we care about every single one to try and ensure that they are pushed to their ability. And I think that's a massive one, knowing their ability. So just be curious of what we can do, be curious of how we can implement it, and just be creative. If you've got a child that is really struggling with something, there's nothing wrong with coming up with a bit of a different idea. SEND students will love to play volleyball with a balloon if they need to be at first, and some of the pupils might not. So what's wrong with having one doing that, one isn't? But I think it's very important that we start to become adaptive teachers rather than differentiate. We adapt throughout the lesson and equip ourselves with the correct tools to be able to adapt rather than this rigid differentiation. This is what you're doing and that's your only outcome. I think if we become adaptable by speaking to these people and communicating, then implementing it, we're giving ourselves to be adaptable on our feet and ensure that that is when full inclusion is achieved and pupils can reach their potential and beyond at times. Because I think one of our biggest problems, if we differentiate as old-fashioned differentiation, this is your worksheet, this is what you want, straight away we're putting a ceiling on the learning of a child. I think we've got to rip that ceiling down and say, just aim for the stars, and if you get there, you get there. If not, you will get there, but I'm going to have to build some blocks for you to climb all the way up there.
Well said, Tom. I want to high five you really, but I want to also get this question in before we finish because both you and I have got a colleague who I think we both both admire quite a lot, and that's Danny Tedford, who I only realised today is the other side of Trafford Park to you, I believe. She's a senior deputy head teacher at Flixton Girls, and I got in touch with Danny when I knew we were going to record today. And Danny's someone I've respected for a long period of time. We did some work together on a couple of projects a few years ago. And Danny asked me to ask this question, and we'll give some context to it once we're discussing it. And she said, how do we make sure PE is aspirational and inclusive enough to create a pathway for more disabled people to see it as a possible career?
I think this is a great question because, like I said before, sport has always been shown to us to be elitist. From what we see on TV, we see the best of the best. And we don't really hear stories at times from sports people, apart from the last few years. And I think the introduction of the Paralympic Games, of the Invictus Games, we're seeing people with physical disabilities a lot of the time here that are performing, and some children can then relate to. But I think it's, as teachers of PE, as heads of PE, as assistant heads in charge of teaching and learning, or SENCOs, we've got to start looking at what is our curriculum. How are we creating a curriculum that is inclusive for every single child? Within our schema work, is there a lesson within that schema work that will give children, if that sport has it, the chance to see how maybe it is slightly adapted if you have a disability? Doesn't mean that every children within that class has, but there's nothing to say at one point that one of your pupils, unfortunately, might go blind, but they don't then take part in physical activity. They've loved football, but they didn't know that blind football existed, and they don't know how it was, so they just become too anxious to take part. But if they've already experienced it and had that because of schema work, and the curriculum is built to ensure that every single time, every single schema work, that the children experience how it is for someone else, not only does it give them the opportunity, if they fall into that, or they might already have that disability or learning need, and they have never thought that they could play football. They've never thought that they could play cricket. They've never thought that they could compete in tennis. But now they've experienced it to see how maybe it's slightly different for them and they can compete. And now they're inspired to do it. That is something that would just be absolutely fantastic. And it also just means that some of our able-bodied students that maybe are fortunate never to have something that, inhabits them to take part in a certain way, and they just start to see, actually, I understand why it's more difficult for some of my friends or some of my peers. And I think it builds up that mutual respect, not only from our students at age 11 to 16 or 18, it just carries on through, and they understand when they become a manager in a workplace at 30 that I know I've got to do a bit more for you, and I totally understand why. And I think it's really important that we build it into our curriculum. Our curriculum is our bedrock of our school. And if our curriculum is exclusive rather than inclusive, we can only expect outcomes that are exclusive rather than inclusive. And I think that's vitally important, because at my school, it is now all about an inclusive curriculum, from whether that's culturally or whether that's to do with the needs of people. I think that's massive.
It's so obviously true, Tom. If the curriculum is exclusive, then of course the outcomes are going to be exclusive by definition.
And it's something that before I moved to my current school, I hadn't looked at it in much detail. It was more of a pipe dream.
I've never thought that before. I can't believe I've never thought that before.
And it was just a bit of a pipe dream. And this started where in my current school, we have a deputy head teacher who was actually one of the independent for one of the 100 most inspiring teachers a couple of years ago. And he's looking at an anti-racist approach and decolonizing the curriculum. So I'd never thought of it by that, but some of the things that are now taken out of our curriculum because they are seeing too many from the white supremacy views, and they're just continuing. Certain books might have been taken out of the curriculum in English because they only look at stuff from a white supremacy view. I never thought of the impact that the curriculum can have until then. And that's when I've really started now, because I'm in a large trust and in a working group within PE that I'm trying to impart that to make sure that every school in our trust, 52 of them that we have, can we start to embed that so not only our pupils, but the wider communities are then impacted in a positive manner.
Fantastic, Tom. And then we mentioned Danny, and obviously I presented Danny's question to you there. And I want to just read something that Danny included in the email when she responded to me with the question. And then I'm going to sort of leave the last word for you, Tom. But Danny said this: also, the disabled performance routes were terrible when I was younger. And I believe if there had been a better performance pathway, I could have had more opportunity to do elite sport. I play National League hockey, and that's fantastic. But I always wondered, what if? So I guess it's all about opportunity and how we ensure we are giving our SEND students lots of it to love PE and to excel. And that phrasing that Dan has used there, I think summarizes in a lot of what you talk about. What if we tweak that? What if the student you talked about, you progress to learn to serve in badminton, for example? What if? And I'll hand over to you for the last word, Tom, but that to me is really stuck in my mind.
And it's totally true. Me growing up, I always think, what if? I played county cricket growing up. I played for North of England growing up. And then I got a bit of a back injury at 16, 17, and I just couldn't bowl. And I was batting all rounder at the time. And I just think, what if? But I had that opportunity. There's people who aren't getting in that position to have that opportunity. And I have been to school when I was a pupil with students who have played Premier League football. When I went back as an LSA, one of them was still a pupil. Unfortunately, we had the opportunity to come back and join in on a Friday afternoon and play dodgeball with the pupils after he played a Champions League game for United on a Tuesday. So it was inspirational. He had that opportunity. But it would fill me with more joy if I seen a pupil who had a more challenging upbringing, who had more challenges and barriers in the way, to see them perform on TV. Because that is what we've got to give the opportunity to inspire our students to be. We want to be an active nation and lead active lives. But we are talking about pupils here who get less of an opportunity. Well, we've got to flip that on its head and give them more of an opportunity.
Brilliant, Tom. And look, I cannot speak with more praise of what you've advocated for this evening. I also want to say that, we talked that I think I referred earlier, you've come into the profession in an orthodox route. It's not so unorthodox really, but I also want to say how vital it is that your voice is heard in this conversation. I don't know if this is a fair thing to ask you, Tom, but I have the impression that people are going to reach out to you when they listen to this. How do you perceive that? By the way, I haven't told you I'm going to ask you this, but can people reach you? Can people reach out and talk to you?
100%. And I think it's vitally important. I think my knowledge of SEND is at a certain level that I feel like I can fully start to embed certain students following some of the things that I've already said. But my knowledge is growing myself by following my National Senko Award, by doing my MPQLT. So reach out to me on Twitter. I'll give you emails that you can contact me on, etc. Because for me, it's not about me and my school. It's about the profession, the children that we teach. And if I can help in any small way, because I'm in the Northwest, specifically in Manchester, there's only so much I can do as an individual. But as a group of PE teachers, a group of professionals working together, we can achieve so much nationally, internationally, globally. And that's what we want. That's what I want as a teacher. And I'm sure that's what many of them do. So if anyone wants to reach out, I'm more than happy to speak to people, whether that is just by social media, whether that's by email, whether if someone wants to pick up the phone, that's more than happy for me. Because if I can give one person that contacts me something that impacts one life chance of a child or improves the lives of one child, that means the world.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to leave this, Tom. Well done in what you're doing. Thank you sincerely for putting time into this. I know for a fact that today was a super hectic day. In fact, we started a couple of minutes late because you literally flew in from school, got through the mad Manchester traffic and managed to get here. So sincerely, I really appreciate it, Tom. And I have the impression that there's going to be a lot of people who this is going to touch and people are going to be really interested in this. I'm also interested to see the different kind of ripples this sends out. As we've talked, I've been really excited to have, interestingly, Senkos listen to this conversation and actually getting that conversation in front of people who are working with SEND on a daily basis, but are not necessarily considering it specifically in PE. And I think there's a real necessity to get this conversation to them too.
Definitely. And I see that from my point of view. I'll see it from my PE lens in there, but I see it from my PE lens from an LSA when the Senko didn't want me supporting PE because you are not needed. And I think it is important that people that can impact it in their position of, if we say, power, start to understand it from a different perspective.
Fantastic. Well done. And thanks again, Tom. Many, many thanks. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.